Welcome back, beautiful minds. Tell me something. Have you ever noticed that the people who fear you the most are the ones who spend the most time imagining a version of you that doesn't even exist? They couldn't defeat the real you, so they created an evil twin in their minds, someone reckless, dangerous, impossible to control. They hoped that shadow would become your downfall, but here's the twist they never saw coming. You didn't fight the darkness they projected onto you. You learned from it. You made it your co-pilot instead of your executioner. And that's the moment their carefully crafted nightmare became your greatest advantage. There is something strangely predictable about people who are threatened by potential instead of reality. They rarely attack who you truly are. That would require courage, observation, and honesty. Instead, they manufacture a character, dress it in your face, and convince themselves that fiction is safer than truth. Long before you ever questioned your own identity, they had already written a script where you became the villain. In their imagination, your confidence became arrogance, your silence became manipulation, your ambition became obsession, your resilience became cruelty. They weren't reacting to your actions anymore. They were reacting to a version of you that only existed inside their own fears. That is how projection works. Someone carries a storm inside themselves and becomes convinced the thunder is coming from you. They can't explain why your presence unsettles them, so they invent explanations. Suddenly, you're too different, too intense, too dangerous, or too unpredictable. None of those labels describe you. They describe the discomfort they feel when standing in front of someone who refuses to shrink. The fascinating part is that they don't realize they're giving you information every single time they misjudge you. Every accusation reveals what they secretly fear. Every rumor exposes the weaknesses they hide. Every attempt to define you without knowing you becomes a confession disguised as criticism. While they believe they're exposing your darkness, they're accidentally exposing their own. Think about it. Why would someone spend so much energy imagining your downfall unless your rise disturbs something inside them? Ordinary people don't obsess over ordinary lives. They don't invent elaborate stories about someone they consider insignificant. Obsession is rarely born from hatred alone. It grows from intimidation mixed with curiosity. Somewhere deep inside, they recognize a possibility in you that they cannot explain, so they replace understanding with suspicion. The tragedy is that many people accept the role assigned to them. After hearing enough false stories, they begin questioning themselves. They wonder if maybe they really are difficult. Maybe they really are impossible to understand. Maybe they should apologize for existing in a way that makes others uncomfortable. Slowly, they begin editing their personality to satisfy an audience that was never interested in the truth to begin with. But you were never meant to become smaller just because someone else's imagination became larger. Every extraordinary person eventually discovers this uncomfortable reality. The moment you refuse to fit predictable patterns, people create explanations that protect their own worldview. It's easier to believe you're secretly broken than to admit you're simply different. It's easier to imagine hidden darkness inside you than to acknowledge untapped strength. The human mind loves simple stories, even when those stories are completely false. Ironically, the fictional version they created often appears stronger than the real one. They describe you as fearless, calculating, impossible to manipulate, emotionally untouchable. They whisper about your influence as though you possess abilities beyond explanation. They exaggerate every decision until you sound larger than life. They intended those descriptions to isolate you, but all they really did was prove how powerful your presence already feels to them. The irony becomes almost poetic. The monster they feared wasn't living inside you. It was living inside the expectations they projected onto you. They built an invisible opponent and exhausted themselves preparing for a battle that never existed. Every strategy they designed, every warning they shared, every attempt to expose you was aimed at someone imaginary. Meanwhile, the real you kept evolving, not because you believed their stories, but because you finally understood what those stories revealed. You realized that fear has terrible eyesight. It cannot distinguish between destruction and transformation. To frighten people, growth always looks dangerous. Confidence always appears threatening. Independence always resembles rebellion. They mistake emotional discipline for emotional emptiness because they have never learned the difference. Once that realization settles into your mind, something changes forever. You stop wasting energy defending yourself against accusations that were never based on evidence. You stop chasing approval from people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop trying to prove your innocence in a courtroom built entirely from assumptions. Instead, you let your actions become louder than their imagination, knowing that truth has a patience lies can never afford. Eventually, something remarkable happens. The very people who invented your so-called evil twin become trapped by their own creation. Every success you achieve forces them to rewrite their narrative. Every obstacle you overcome destroys another chapter of the story they wrote about you. Every calm response to their chaos exposes how inaccurate their assumptions always were. They expected a monster. They encountered discipline. They prepared for destruction. They witnessed evolution, and without realizing it, they spent so much time imagining your power that they unknowingly became the first people to recognize it. Most people spend their entire lives running from the parts of themselves they were taught to fear. The moment they feel anger, they bury it. The moment they feel ambition, they apologize for it. The moment they discover an edge inside themselves, they dull it so other people can remain comfortable. Society has a strange habit of convincing powerful people that their greatest strength is actually their greatest flaw. So they lock away their shadow, hoping that if they ignore it long enough, they'll become easier to love. That's exactly what your critics expected you to do. They believed the darker side of your personality would eventually consume you. They imagined a version of you driven by revenge, ego, and chaos. They convinced themselves that if they pushed you hard enough, your so-called evil twin would finally appear and destroy everything you had built. They waited for the explosion. They rehearsed speeches about how they always knew this would happen. They mistook emotional intensity for emotional instability because they had never learned the difference. But what they failed to understand is that darkness isn't always destruction. Sometimes darkness is simply awareness. It's the part of you that refuses to be manipulated twice. It's the instinct that notices deception before words are spoken. It's the voice that tells you to walk away from fake loyalty, empty promises, and smiling betrayal. People who have never faced themselves assume every shadow is dangerous because they've never discovered that shadows can also become wisdom. The strongest people are rarely the ones without darkness. They're the ones who stopped pretending it wasn't there. They understand that denying part of yourself doesn't eliminate it. It only hands control over to emotions you refuse to acknowledge. Suppressed anger becomes resentment. Suppressed confidence becomes insecurity. Suppressed courage becomes regret. Whatever you refuse to understand eventually begins controlling you from behind the curtain. You chose a different path. Instead of pretending to be endlessly agreeable, you started asking difficult questions. Instead of forcing yourself to smile through disrespect, you learned the value of silence. Instead of confusing kindness with weakness, you realized that compassion without boundaries eventually becomes self-destruction. Every painful experience sharpened your awareness instead of poisoning your character. Every betrayal became another lesson about human nature. Every disappointment became another layer of emotional discipline. That's when your shadow stopped looking like an enemy. It became the part of you that could remain calm while everyone else panicked. It became the reason you no longer chased validation from people who had already decided not to understand you. It became the quiet strength that allowed you to stand alone without confusing loneliness with failure. While others needed constant approval to feel valuable, you began finding certainty within yourself. That transformation confused people. They expected wounds to make you bitter. Instead, they made you observant. They expected rejection to make you desperate. Instead, it made you selective. They expected pain to harden your heart beyond repair. Instead, it taught you exactly where your heart deserved to be invested. The darkness they feared wasn't creating a monster. It was creating discernment. There's a massive difference. A monster destroys everyone in its path. Discernment simply refuses to invite danger inside. One seeks revenge. The other seeks peace. One is controlled by emotion. The other understands emotion without becoming its prisoner. People who lack emotional maturity often can't tell those two things apart. To them, every boundary feels like hostility. Every act of self-respect feels like arrogance. Every refusal to tolerate disrespect feels like cruelty. That's because boundaries expose people who benefited from your lack of them. The moment you stop accepting manipulation, manipulators call you difficult. The moment you stop explaining yourself endlessly, critics call you cold. The moment you stop sacrificing your peace to protect someone else's comfort, they accuse you of changing. In reality, you didn't become darker. You simply became harder to exploit. Your shadow wasn't built through hatred. It was built through experience. Every broken promise taught it patience. Every lie taught it observation. Every disappointment taught it restraint. Every season of isolation taught it independence. While everyone else believed they were creating your downfall, life was quietly building the strongest version of you behind closed doors. The greatest irony is that the people who feared your shadow helped shape it. Every attempt to undermine you strengthened your awareness. Every betrayal sharpened your judgment. Every false accusation reinforced your commitment to living by your own principles instead of someone else's expectations. They believed they were feeding an enemy, but they were actually strengthening your ability to recognize truth from illusion. And once a person reaches that level of self-awareness, they stop fearing the darkness within them because they finally understand it was never there to destroy them. It was there to protect everything worth becoming. There comes a moment in every extraordinary life when the greatest battle is no longer against the people outside you. It's against the instinct to keep fighting yourself. For years, you may have believed that your sharp instincts were flaws, your intensity was dangerous, and your refusal to tolerate nonsense made you difficult. You spent countless hours trying to silence the side of yourself that refused to be manipulated because you were taught that being accepted was more important than being authentic. But eventually, something inside you became exhausted, not from carrying your darkness, but from pretending it didn't exist. That was the moment everything changed. The people watching from a distance thought you were becoming colder. They whispered that something about you felt different. They couldn't explain it, but your energy no longer invited unnecessary conflict. Their words no longer reached the emotional places they once controlled. Their opinions no longer dictated your direction. What they mistook for emotional emptiness was actually emotional mastery. You had stopped wasting your strength on battles that were never yours to begin with. Most people spend their lives at war with themselves. They divide their personality into acceptable and unacceptable pieces. They celebrate the parts that earn applause and bury the parts that demand respect. But a divided mind can never become a powerful one. Every ounce of energy spent denying your own nature is energy stolen from your future. You cannot become unstoppable while secretly apologizing for your own existence. The people who wanted your downfall counted on that internal conflict. They believed that if they criticized you enough, you'd begin doubting yourself. They expected your own mind to become their greatest weapon. They assumed that insecurity would accomplish what confrontation never could. After all, the easiest person to defeat is someone constantly arguing with themselves. Instead, you did something they never prepared for. You stopped treating your darkness like a criminal and started treating it like a teacher. You listened to the part of yourself that noticed hidden motives. You respected the instincts that warned you when something felt dishonest. You honored the anger that appeared whenever your values were violated, not because anger deserved control, but because it deserved understanding. Every emotion carried information. Every uncomfortable feeling contained a lesson. Once you stopped judging those emotions, they stopped controlling you. That's the difference between emotional maturity and emotional repression. Repression buries truth until it explodes. Maturity studies truth until it becomes wisdom. Your so-called evil twin was never asking to take over your life. It was asking to stop being ignored. It represented every lesson learned through betrayal, every boundary built after disappointment, every scar that quietly reminded you what happens when you abandon yourself to satisfy others. It wasn't demanding revenge. It was demanding awareness. Suddenly, your decisions became clearer. You stopped chasing people who repeatedly walked away. You stopped explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped mistaking attention for respect and familiarity for loyalty. The emotional noise faded because your inner conflict faded first. When your mind stopped fighting itself, the outside world lost one of its easiest ways to control you. People noticed not because you became louder, but because you became calmer. Calmness has a strange effect on those who rely on emotional chaos. They expect arguments and receive silence. They expect panic and receive patience. They expect guilt and receive confidence. It's deeply unsettling to someone who survives by provoking reactions. When they can no longer predict your emotional responses, they begin losing their psychological advantage. That's why your transformation frightened them. They weren't afraid of aggression. Aggression is easy to manipulate. They were afraid of discipline. A disciplined mind doesn't need constant validation. It doesn't react to every insult. It doesn't waste precious energy proving its worth to people who have already made up their minds. It chooses its battles with precision, and because of that, every move carries greater weight. The version of you they feared wasn't born through rage. It was born through integration. You no longer separated your kindness from your strength. You no longer believed compassion required self-sacrifice. You no longer confused forgiveness with permission. Your empathy remained intact, but it was finally protected by wisdom. Your confidence remained humble because it was built on experience instead of ego. Every piece of yourself that once seemed contradictory now worked together toward the same purpose. The irony is almost impossible to ignore. The people who tried to awaken your downfall ended up accelerating your evolution. Every attempt to provoke you became another opportunity to strengthen your discipline. Every betrayal became another reason to trust your instincts. Every misunderstanding became another reminder that clarity doesn't require universal agreement. While they celebrated what they believed was your internal collapse, you were quietly assembling the strongest version of yourself, one that no longer feared the shadows, because every part of your identity had finally learned to move in the same direction. Fear has a peculiar habit of exposing itself without ever saying its own name. It disguises itself as criticism, skepticism, gossip, and carefully crafted warnings. The people who feared your potential couldn't admit they were intimidated by your growth, so they did something far easier. They turned their fear into a blueprint. Every assumption they made about your future became a prediction they desperately wanted to believe. They convinced themselves that one day your ambition would destroy you, your confidence would isolate you, and your resilience would eventually collapse under its own weight. They weren't describing your destiny. They were describing the outcome that made them feel safe. What they never realized was that every accusation carried hidden instructions. When someone called you too quiet, you discovered the strength of observation. When they accused you of being too intense, you realized that passion often makes comfortable people uncomfortable. When they labeled you difficult, you started questioning whether the real problem was your behavior or their inability to control you. Their judgments became unexpected lessons, revealing not who you were, but what frightened them most about someone they couldn't predict. That was the turning point. Most people spend years trying to prove their critics wrong. They exhaust themselves chasing approval from audiences that have already decided on the ending of their story. Every achievement becomes another attempt to silence doubters. Every success becomes another plea to finally be understood. But no amount of evidence changes a mind committed to misunderstanding you. Some people protect their pride by refusing to update their opinions, no matter how much reality changes. You eventually understood that truth. Instead of arguing with their perception, you studied it. You noticed patterns hidden inside their words. The things they mocked were often the very qualities that later became your greatest strengths. They laughed at your patience until patience gave you opportunities they could never wait long enough to receive. They criticized your independence until their dependence on other people's opinions left them emotionally exhausted. They dismissed your discipline until discipline quietly produced results that excuses never could. Without intending to, they mapped out your future. Every insult pointed toward an ability worth sharpening. Every rejection revealed an area where you no longer needed external validation. Every betrayal forced you to become more aware, more selective, and more emotionally intelligent. What they thought was discouragement became direction. That is the strange power of perspective. Two people can experience the exact same criticism and walk away with completely different lives. One person accepts it as a limitation. The other accepts it as information. One allows it to shrink their identity. The other uses it to refine their purpose. The difference isn't found in the words spoken against them. It's found in the meaning they choose to assign to those words. You stopped hearing attacks. You started hearing clues. When someone underestimated your ability, you didn't feel insulted anymore. You felt informed. Underestimation creates freedom. It removes expectations. It lowers defenses. It gives you room to grow without constant interference. The very people celebrating your supposed weakness unknowingly gave you the perfect environment to become stronger. That's why their fear became your blueprint. Every attempt to define your limits showed you exactly where no limits actually existed. Every effort to discourage you revealed another reason to keep moving. Every prediction of failure became motivation to master another skill, strengthen another habit, and sharpen another part of your character. While they remained focused on controlling the story about you, you stayed focused on improving the person inside the story. There's an important psychological truth hidden inside this transformation. Fear almost always exaggerates. It imagines disasters that haven't happened. It assumes the worst before evidence exists. Your critics weren't responding to facts. They were responding to possibilities they couldn't emotionally handle. They feared what you might become far more than what you already were. Ironically, their imagination became more powerful than your reality. And because they spent so much time imagining your future strength, they unknowingly encouraged you to discover it yourself. Every obstacle they placed in your path forced you to develop patience. Every closed door taught you creativity. Every season of isolation strengthened your independence. Every unfair judgment sharpened your emotional discipline. Had they welcomed you with open arms, you might never have developed the resilience that now defines you. Sometimes resistance creates abilities comfort never could. Looking back, you begin to realize something almost unsettling. The blueprint for your transformation was never hidden inside motivational speeches, lucky opportunities, or perfect circumstances. It was scattered throughout every doubt, every criticism, every false assumption, and every attempt to convince you that you were less capable than you truly were. They believed they were writing the story of your collapse, but line by line, prediction by prediction, and fear by fear, they unknowingly handed you the exact design for the person you were always meant to become. The greatest mistake your enemies ever made wasn't underestimating your strength. It was misunderstanding the purpose of the version of you they feared. In their minds, your so-called evil twin was supposed to be reckless, destructive, and impossible to control. They imagined a personality driven by revenge, consumed by anger, and blinded by ego. They believed that if life pushed you hard enough, this darker version would emerge and destroy everything you had worked to build. They waited patiently for that moment, convinced that your greatest threat was hidden inside your own mind. They couldn't have been more wrong. The version of you they feared wasn't born to ruin your future. It existed to protect it. Every difficult experience had quietly shaped another side of your character. Every betrayal strengthened your awareness. Every disappointment sharpened your judgment. Every broken promise taught you to recognize patterns that others ignored. While people assumed your pain was creating instability, it was actually creating precision. The wounds they expected to make you irrational were teaching you exactly where not to bleed again. That's why your so-called evil twin never became your enemy. It became your greatest ally, not because it encouraged cruelty, but because it refused to let kindness become self-destruction. It reminded you that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting. It taught you that compassion without boundaries eventually becomes permission for abuse. It showed you that protecting your peace is not selfish. It is necessary. Every lesson your softer side struggled to accept, this stronger side quietly understood without hesitation. There is an enormous difference between becoming heartless and becoming wise. Heartless people stop caring. Wise people simply stop sacrificing themselves for those who never cared in return. The outside world often confuses these two things because emotional maturity makes fewer dramatic speeches. It doesn't announce every decision. It doesn't seek applause for setting boundaries. It simply changes direction and never looks back. To people who depended on your emotional availability, that silence feels threatening. They mistake your peace for distance because they benefited from your confusion. You began noticing something fascinating. The more you accepted every part of yourself, the less control other people had over your emotions. Insults that once lingered for days now disappeared within minutes. Rejection no longer felt like proof of your worthlessness. Betrayal stopped surprising you because experience had already prepared you for human inconsistency. Your emotional balance wasn't built by avoiding darkness. It was built by understanding it. That understanding changed everything. Instead of reacting immediately, you started observing. Instead of trusting words, you trusted patterns. Instead of chasing explanations, you accepted actions. Your decisions became quieter, but they also became stronger. The people expecting emotional chaos suddenly found themselves standing in front of someone who couldn't be manipulated through guilt, fear, or false promises anymore. That was deeply unsettling. Manipulation only works when someone is disconnected from themselves. It depends on self-doubt. It feeds on emotional confusion. It survives by convincing people to ignore their instincts in exchange for temporary approval. But the moment you accepted your stronger side, those old strategies stopped working. You no longer argued with your intuition. You no longer apologized for protecting your peace. You no longer negotiated with people who repeatedly showed you exactly who they were. The irony was impossible to ignore. The evil twin they expected to destroy your life became the very reason your life stopped falling apart. It encouraged patience when anger demanded revenge. It encouraged observation when emotion demanded reaction. It encouraged discipline when pride demanded attention. What they imagined as darkness was actually emotional intelligence wearing armor. People who never confront themselves often fear anyone who has. That's because self-awareness cannot be manipulated as easily as insecurity. Once someone understands both their strengths and their weaknesses, they become incredibly difficult to control. They no longer chase validation from people committed to misunderstanding them. They no longer confuse loneliness with failure or popularity with purpose. They become comfortable walking alone if walking alone means walking honestly. That quiet confidence changes the atmosphere around them. Some people become inspired, others become uncomfortable, not because you've become dangerous, but because you've become unavailable to the games that once distracted you. Your energy is no longer consumed by proving yourself. It is invested in becoming yourself. Looking back, you realize the entire battle was built on a misunderstanding. Everyone expected you to wage war against your own shadow. They assumed you would spend years suppressing the strongest lessons life had ever taught you. Instead, you welcomed those lessons, refined them, and transformed them into wisdom. The darker side they feared never took control of your life. It simply stood beside your compassion, your discipline, and your vision like a trusted co-pilot, making sure you never again abandoned yourself just to make someone else comfortable. And that quiet alliance became the foundation of a strength no amount of opposition could ever dismantle. The room always changes when people realize they're no longer dealing with the version of you they thought they understood. At first, they believe you're predictable. They assume they know exactly which words will trigger you, which situations will break your confidence, and which pressures will make you abandon your principles. They build their entire strategy around the idea that eventually you'll be forced to choose between your kindness and your strength. They expect one side to destroy the other. They never imagine the possibility that both sides might eventually stand together. That realization arrives slowly. It's not announced with dramatic speeches or grand victories. It appears in the silence after their manipulation fails. It hides inside the calm expression you wear when chaos surrounds you. It reveals itself when you refuse to chase people who walk away, refuse to defend yourself against every false accusation, and refuse to sacrifice your peace just to satisfy someone else's expectations. That's when they begin to notice something unsettling. You aren't switching between two personalities anymore. You've become one complete person. Most people live divided lives. They show confidence in public and insecurity in private. They speak about courage while secretly fearing rejection. They preach kindness while quietly resenting everyone around them. Their identities are fractured because they spend more time performing than understanding themselves. Every contradiction creates another weakness waiting to be exploited. But something different happened to you. The experiences that were supposed to tear you apart slowly stitched you together. Every betrayal forced you to strengthen your judgment. Every disappointment taught you emotional discipline. Every season of loneliness introduced you to parts of yourself that constant company had always distracted you from discovering. The pain didn't split your identity. It unified it. That is why people stopped recognizing the old version of you. You no longer needed to pretend to be endlessly patient while secretly feeling exhausted. You no longer smiled through disrespect just to appear mature. You no longer confused silence with fear or boundaries with guilt. Your kindness remained, but it was protected by wisdom. Your confidence remained, but it was balanced by humility. Your compassion remained, but it was guided by discernment instead of blind trust. That combination is incredibly rare. Strength without compassion becomes tyranny. Compassion without strength becomes self-neglect. When those qualities finally learn to work together, something extraordinary happens. You stop reacting from emotion alone and begin responding from clarity. Every decision becomes intentional instead of impulsive. Every relationship becomes a choice instead of a dependency. Every obstacle becomes information instead of intimidation. The people watching from the outside can't explain this transformation. They continue searching for the old weaknesses because that's where they built their confidence. They expect anger and find patience. They expect desperation and find independence. They expect insecurity and find quiet certainty. Every prediction fails because it was written for someone who no longer exists. That's when fear begins changing sides. At first, you were the one afraid of losing people, losing opportunities, losing approval, and losing your place in the world. Now they're the ones afraid that they can no longer influence your emotions, afraid that guilt no longer controls your decisions, afraid that their opinions no longer shape your identity, afraid that you've become impossible to manipulate because you've stopped negotiating with your own values. Control disappears the moment self-awareness arrives. A person who understands both their light and their shadow doesn't panic every time life becomes difficult. They don't need perfection to feel worthy. They don't need constant praise to remain motivated. They understand that flaws don't erase value and mistakes don't define identity. That understanding creates an inner stability that no external opinion can easily shake. Ironically, the people who tried to expose your weakness became witnesses to your evolution. Every challenge they placed before you became another opportunity to refine your character. Every rumor became another reminder that truth doesn't require everyone's agreement. Every setback became another reason to trust your resilience instead of your circumstances. Without realizing it, they contributed to the very transformation they feared. They expected an internal civil war. Instead, they watched an alliance form. Your confidence stopped competing with your humility. Your courage stopped competing with your compassion. Your ambition stopped competing with your integrity. Every part of your identity finally began moving toward the same destination. There was no longer a battle between the person the world expected you to be and the person you knew you were becoming. There was only direction, and that is the moment every strategy built against you quietly collapses. Because no manipulation can divide someone who has already made peace with every part of themselves. No criticism can weaken someone who has already examined their own flaws. No fear can control someone who has learned to walk beside both their light and their darkness without allowing either to rule them. The greatest victory was never proving your enemies wrong. It was becoming so internally united that the version of you they once called an evil twin became nothing more than another trusted voice, helping guide the same unstoppable soul toward a future they could never prevent.